Well, really, the plants are just the tip of the iceberg, right? What we're starting to see in suggestions like this suggestion from the Productivity Commissioner is the idea of apartments that don't have natural light coming in through their windows.
Mm.
And yes, that'll mean dead plants, but it'll also mean really unhappy people.
Well, what do people who currently living, say, in the inner city units, now they don't get direct sunlight, they may be facing another high-rise block as well. There are still buyers of those apartments.
It's absolutely true that there are apartments out there, although in New South Wales about 20 years ago, rules were brought in to prevent that from happening into the future because we started to realise that a lot of those apartments were just not providing a good quality of life to the residents. Certainly in other states, we start to see some south-facing apartments that don't get that natural light. Research has shown that people really don't like that though. They'll be willing to pay for it because we're in a housing crisis and people are willing to kind of put up with a lot in order to get a roof over their heads. But the reality is we know that long term it's really bad for their mental health, it's really bad for their quality of life, it's really bad for their access to warmth, to sunlight, to passive cooling and heating that natural light enables for them. And so they spend more on electricity to cool their house, to warm their house. So there are a whole bunch of unintended consequences that come from this. And whilst I understand that people are desperate right now, they often learn to or live to regret it.
Okay, but how do you see that factoring into the pricing of property as well? Because as we know, when you go to buy a property, it all depends on, one, your budget, and then two, whether you like the view, whether there's a balcony, whether there's a window. Obviously, apartments have different pricing depending on what they offer.
Yeah, this proposal from the Productivity Commissioner was predicated on the idea that we need to get the price of houses down because they're getting too expensive. And it's undoubtedly true. Sydney is maybe the second least affordable city in the entire world. So we've got to do something about house prices. This isn't the answer, but there are a lot of other suggestions included in the Productivity Commission's work that could start to reduce prices without materially affecting people's ability to live a good life in an apartment.
Okay,
So, for example,
so developers, I beg your pardon, developers are saying that relaxing these design-related requirements would reduce costs, improve supply and affordability. So obviously the developers are tapped into the housing crisis as well. You say that perhaps there are other options that they can look at. What would those options include?
Well, let's be clear, they're right. It would reduce the cost of the houses. It's just that the price, the benefit of that is not worth it. Other options available that would also reduce prices that were going to have less of a material effect on people's quality of life include things like getting rid of car parking requirements. In a lot of parts of Sydney and in a lot of parts of other cities around Australia, there is a requirement to build a lot of car parking underneath a building. But if that building is right next to a train station, they probably don't need that many car parking spots.
Just on the issue of car parking, transportation, the issue of housing affordability, of course, goes hand in hand with the issues of access to public transport as well. What's being looked at there, particularly for Sydney and wider New South Wales?
Yeah, so one of the big changes that the New South Wales government has brought in recently is their transport-oriented development project. That's essentially about 40 different train station locations where a lot of density, a lot of apartments are being built directly around that train station. And that's a really good idea because it starts to reduce those transport costs for the people that live in those apartments. But it's only going to be effective if we ensure that they don't just have access to a train station, they also have access to all the other amenity and infrastructure that makes for a good life. So that means playgrounds, that means childcare centres, that means healthcare, that means shopping centres, that means parks. So there's a lot of work to be done, but starting with the train station is a fantastic first step.
All right, Eamon Waterford from the Committee of Sydney. I see you've got a window there, getting some sunlight into your apartment. That's lovely. Thanks very much for joining us here on Weekend Breakfast.